During the years of deepening crisis as the world slipped toward World War II, as Japan expanded throughout China, as Mussolini rose to power and attacked Ethiopia, as Adolf Hitler began his quest for Lebensraum, the United States and the Western democracies seemed almost paralyzed, hoping that something would stay the course, that something would distract or change what everyone seemed to know was an inevitable fact, that war was coming and yet no one wanted to face. And in America, we had done this before. We had fought in World War I. Thousands of American boys were buried in French soil. The fabric of American society had been shaken. And in a move to head off, to try to avoid the coming cataclysm, Americans retreated to isolationism. As a reaction, and everything, I keep going back to this, the 1920s and the 1930s are a reaction to the events of World War I. And a Senate inquiry was launched after World War I to examine the roots of the conflict. The committee was formed in the Senate by under the leadership of Gerald Nye, whom you see in the center of the PowerPoint, Senator Gerald Nye, a Republican from North Dakota. As one observer said, he was just crazy enough and yet was honest enough to take his committeeship serious. And so we began the investigation of the relationship between the coming of World War I, Woodrow Wilson, the bankers, and the merchant, as what he called the merchants of death. Specifically, he looked at from 1934 to 1937. They examined all of the documents, interviewed people, and engaged in what Democrats, because it was Woodrow Wilson in office, if it had been a Republican, they would have been all for it. But what they engaged, they accused Nye of engaging in a witch hunt for evidence that wasn't there. And in fact, he never did find a smoking gun, a memo from J.P. Morgan to Woodrow Wilson insisting that the United States had to get involved into World War I. But what the Nye Committee concluded was that the Wilson administration had been duped by the merchants of death. That they may not have had a direct impact on Wilson's decisions, but the accumulated effect of the advice coming to Wilson was that he leaned toward entering the conflict. And thus the result of the Nye Committee is that the United States should remain neutral in the current world crisis. Watching as the 1930s transpired and the events seemed to be spiraling out of control, Americans wanted to stay out of it, wanted to keep Americans out of war zones, wanted to stay out of the conflict, stay off of belligerent vessels, stay out of any circumstance that could lead to American involvement. Harking back to World War I, not sailing on ships that are going in harm's way, embargoing arms shipments to prevent American businesses from fueling a war fever, halt the loaning of money to warring parties, and set quotas on the number of contrabands that could be shipped to any warring party. And so the neutrality laws of the 1930s, as events seemed to warrant, would keep Americans out of all those circumstances that would put them in a position that might get the United States involved in a crisis. And it moved the nation toward complete isolation. But while Americans wanted to stay out of the conflict, while they wanted to stay away from the events, there's a growing fear of national security. And what you're going to see as we cover the events of the 1930s is that with these neutrality laws and the conflict going on around the globe, it became increasingly obvious to Americans that avoiding it was inevitable. That avoiding it and being able to stay out of it was impossible. Getting in the conflict was inevitable. And so the series of neutrality acts, and I've listed them out, kind of summarized them for you. The first Neutrality Act was passed in 1935, the Neutrality Act of 1935. As the conditions in Ethiopia worsened and Italy, the build-up to a war against Ethiopia, Italy attacking Ethiopia, the Neutrality Act of 1935 established and forbade the sale of arms and munitions to all belligerents whenever the president proclaimed a state of war existed. Now, Roosevelt wanted discretionary authority. He wanted the ability to declare that one side was an aggressor so that the United States could trade with the defender and not the aggressor. But he accepted the fact that quarantining and embargoing against both sides was better than nothing. And so he signed it because it would only be in effect, the Neutrality Act of 1935 would only be in effect for 6 months, so signed in August of 1935. It placed an embargo on armaments and war materials against all parties in a conflict, and all Americans traveling on warring parties' vessels did so at their own risk. And when Italy does attack Ethiopia, President Roosevelt will declare a state of war and enact the Neutrality Act of 1935. He will implement it. Activate would probably be a better word there. He would activate the Neutrality Act of 1935. The problem with this is, what about poor Ethiopia? They are being assaulted by a modern first world power. And they desperately need the arms and equipment to defend themselves against Mussolini's, I don't want to use juggernaut because it turns out he didn't have a juggernaut. Mussolini struggled to defeat the Ethiopians and Haile Selassie's army. They ultimately will, for a short while, gain the upper hand in Ethiopia. And then Italy's distracted by events in Europe and has to pull most of their forces back. But with the enactment of the Neutrality Act of 1935, he called upon Congress to modify the Neutrality Act, which Congress steadfastly refused to do. And in fact, when Congress reconvenes in 1936 and creates the Neutrality Act of 1936, in February of 1936 to replace the expiring Neutrality Act of 1935. It not only renewed all the provisions in the previous conflict and the previous Neutrality Act, but it added a provision against loans and credits to warring powers. So preventing not only the sale of arms, but the lending of money, going even beyond what President Roosevelt had suggested. And then the problem with the Act of 1936 is quickly revealed because in 1936, as we talked about last time, July of 1936, the Spanish Civil War begins. The problem is these acts are based upon the president declaring a state of war. Well, what about a civil war? That's not between international aggressors. That's between two parties within a country. Even if those two parties are backed by international powers, what do? And so the Neutrality Act of 1936 proved to be inadequate in dealing with the Civil War. And so it's going to force some revisions. And so a second revision was tacked onto the Neutrality Act of 1936 in July of 1936. A proviso was added to the Neutrality Act, extending the act to apply to civil wars. Franklin Roosevelt accepted the British and French approach that it was better to isolate aggressors, and so he wasn't that concerned about what was going on in Spain with the Civil War. But as that grows from the Spanish Civil War into the beginnings of what would be an European conflict, he grows increasingly concerned. Roosevelt asked for a moral embargo on the arms trade, and he encouraged Congress to extend the laws with regard to civil war like they had in July of 1936. And so in 1937, you're going to get the third of the Neutrality Acts. You also, in the United States, get kind of a, if you graph it out, a peak of the isolationist sentiment. In working in research in this area, I wrote a paper once on public opinion before and after Pearl Harbor. And the Gallup polling organization was very active in the 1930s. And one of their regular polling questions is, should the United States get involved in a European war? Should the United States get involved in an Asian war? What is your opinion on, and they would measure, and there's a quantifiable isolationist sentiment that reaches a peak of 94% of Americans don't want to get involved in an international conflict. And so that spring, the spring of 1937, January and then spring, January of 1937 and then May of 1937, they enact very specific legislation because companies had found ways around the Neutrality Act of 1936 by indirectly trading arms and goods to Spain and Spanish forces, specifically the United States, and many in the United States supported the Republic of Spain and Republican forces over the fascist forces. So the Neutrality Act of 1937 said no arms trade to Spain, period. It included the provisions of the previous two acts and extended them to cover all civil wars, but then expanded even further and said no U.S. ships in war zones and no U.S. citizens on warring nations' ships. And in this, it did not expire, instead making this a permanent Neutrality Act, but adding in a proviso, added in May of 1937, that allowed for the president to determine nations that could trade with the United States that were belligerent nations, and allowing an exemption on certain arms and certain equipment on a cash and carry basis, meaning they don't get credit, they don't get to do a loan, they have to come and buy and pay cash and ship it away in their ships. American ships aren't going to enter the war zones. And so this allowed American merchants, in fact, American merchants love this. It allowed them to make profits without any risk because they're not going to be in the war zone. And so the Neutrality Act of 1937 seemed to be favorable for everybody. The new law, though, the Neutrality Act of 1937, will be tested when Japan and Chinese forces clash in July of 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge. Neither side declared war. And so Franklin Roosevelt was able to avoid the Neutrality Acts, which would have favored the Japanese, because the Japanese, as a more industrialized force, would be able to use the laws to their advantage to import what they needed, while the Chinese could not, especially once all of the Chinese ports fall to the Japanese. So since neither side declared war and FDR was able to avoid invoking the neutrality law, he was able to do this since China had greater needs of American arms, but few means to get supplies past the Japanese Navy. And so since Roosevelt couldn't trade directly with China, what he began doing is trading indirectly with China. In the 1980s, this is going to get Ronald Reagan in trouble in the Iran-Contra trials and hearings. But Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing. He traded arms and equipment, sold them to Britain, sold them to France, sold them to Australia, sold them to any neutral power that would then trade them with China, but especially Britain, and using the Burma Road to get those supplies to China. A flourishing munitions trade flowed around the world as ships carried American goods across the Atlantic to England, and then from England to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong and later Burma to the Republic of China forces. While FDR could then hide behind pure isolationism. Roosevelt began testing the waters, though, in October of 1937. In October 5th, 1937, in a speech in Chicago, he denounced what he called the worldwide reign of terror and international lawlessness. He went on to say in which 10% of the world's population threatened the peace, safety, and security of 90% of the world's population. In this speech, he's declared that there should be, not that he did, but that there should be a quarantine against those nations, and I quote, creating a state of international anarchy and instability from which there is no escape through mere isolation or neutrality, end quote. This is known in international and political circles as a trial balloon. Roosevelt was testing the waters, if you will, to see how the public would react. And react they did. Roosevelt's popularity took a huge hit. The American people were incredibly angry over what appeared to be a change in policy. The reaction was so vitriolic that it forced Roosevelt to back off. In fact, I would argue that Roosevelt should never have done this in person anyway. This is why you have vice presidents. John Nance Garner was the vice president at the time. He should have sent John Nance Garner as the vice president out to give this speech. If the public reacts angry, the president has deniability. The president can say, hey, we let the vice president out of his office. He was off his meds. Sorry, we're not changing policy. We'll make sure the vice president doesn't get out again. Instead, Roosevelt, by doing it himself, he takes the hit. I mean, that's why you have vice presidents, besides waiting for you to die, is to throw them out and let them take the heat for the administration. And so Roosevelt mishandled it, and his popularity took a hit. But after the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, Franklin Roosevelt no longer even pretended to be impartial in the coming struggle. In fact, he urged Congress to repeal the embargo and permit the U.S. to sell arms on a permanent cash and carry basis to Great Britain and France. But Congress wouldn't budge. When the Germans attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, Franklin Roosevelt proclaimed official neutrality, but in a radio address to the American people, he said, and I quote, even a neutral has a right to take account of the facts, end quote. And after the fall of Poland, Roosevelt calls Congress into special session and asks them to amend the Neutrality Acts. He said, and I quote, I regret that Congress passed the act. I regret equally that I signed the act. And thus, under the new law, the Neutrality Act of 1939, the Allies could buy supplies with cash and carry them away in their own ships or anything else they wanted. American ships were excluded from belligerent ports and from specified war zones decreed by the president. Increasingly, American public opinion turned in favor of the Allies. After the attack on Poland in the fall, September 1st of 1939, and Poland falls in October of 1939, Britain and France declare war on Germany, but then what follows is called the Sitzkrieg. In fact, this cartoon it embodies the Sitzkrieg. You have out on the island, you have Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and on the continent you have Edouard Daladier, the French Foreign Minister, and they've declared war on Germany, and Daladier says, "When shall we start?" And Chamberlain's reply, "Start what?" And Daladier, "The war." And Chamberlain's reply, "What war?" Because the Sitzkrieg, the phony war, the sitting war, nothing happened. Hitler had taken Poland, and then he didn't attack anybody else. He didn't attack the West. And so maybe it was done. But as Hitler's tyranny grew across the areas he controlled, Americans came to support measures short of war and agreed with Roosevelt's tactics, even though they did not desire to get involved with the conflict. And so what seemed was that this would be a long war of attrition, just like World War I, in which Britain and France would have the resources to outlast Hitler. And so everyone sat around and wondered, how long is this conflict going to last and how many people are going to die? But the winter of 1939 into 1940 passed without event, and the world just set. Until the spring of 1940. In the spring of 1940, after the long winter lull, fighting erupted as Hitler launched the Blitzkrieg on Western Europe, the Lightning War, predicated, as we talked about with Poland, on air power, artillery, and the tank, moving as fast as possible to secure. Hitler is going to overrun the Low Countries. On April the 9th, 1940, without warning, German troops entered Denmark. Denmark fell in a day. Norway fell within a few weeks. On May 10th, 1940, Hitler attacked neutral Belgium and neutral the Netherlands, Holland. Racing across the Low Countries, and once again, having learned the lesson after World War I, the French had fortified their frontier, and you can see on the map the dark blue line running from the Belgian frontier all the way over to Switzerland. That entire area is the Maginot Line, an incredibly dense fortification system of concrete fortifications with massive field artillery emplaced in bunkers in depth. So it's not just a single line, it's a line in depth that would have cost Germany in incredible casualties if they had tried to breach the Maginot Line. But because of France's relationship with Belgium, they didn't build the line across the northern French frontier with Belgium. And so when Germany invades, you can see they just simply bypass the Maginot Line and storm through the Low Countries into the unfortified, not unprotected, because there are French divisions there. They're just not up to the speed and capabilities of the Germans. In fact, French had some of the finest equipment on the Western Front at the outbreak of war. But due to a failure of French leadership and quick movement, almost extremely radical movement by the Germans, they were able to either overrun or bypass many of the French installments and reach the coast in just a matter of days. And as you can see, the British send in the British Expeditionary Force into Belgium to fortify the Belgians. But as the Germans race toward the English Channel, very reminiscent of World War I, only this time they're not stopping for trench warfare. They are running pell-mell, full out with mechanized tanks and trucks carrying the attack forward. They're able to split the French from the British Expeditionary Force and the Belgians, and then the Germans began tightening the noose around the British Expeditionary Force, while at the same time racing into France. So May 21st, 1940, German troops reached the English Channel, cutting off British forces from the French. And this led to a evacuation that we'll talk about in a minute. And then the Germans turned on Paris itself, bringing the fall of Paris within just weeks. And you can see the picture of, now unlike the Sudetenland and the picture of the lady crying in the Sudetenland, tears of joy, this is a Parisian crying tears of sadness as he sees German troops marching through the heart of Paris. You see Hitler's antics and mimicry of French and British generals as he celebrates the fall of France. And then to continue a theme that I introduced with World War I, you see in the lower corner the Peace Garden, where monuments had been set up to French sacrifices in World War I. And you see the train car. This is the train car where the Germans had to sign the peace the French had to sign the peace at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. This is the train car that the Germans had to sign the armistice to end World War I. It was now a monument, and Hitler insisted that France's surrender had to be signed in that train car. And reading about that moment, Hitler and his entourage arrived. They arrived late to make the French officials wait around. Hitler enters the train car, issues his demands, and then leaves, leaving Ribbentrop to get the document signed and finalize it. You see the German victory parade at the Arc de Triomphe, and Hitler posing in front of the Eiffel Tower. All signs of German victory and German payback for the defeat in World War I. Britain, on the other hand, is forced to evacuate its army, the British Expeditionary Force, from the beaches of Dunkirk. And so you can see in the bottom pictures the boats scrapped together to save more than 338,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers. 338,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers that are evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. You know, if you want to make a list of mistakes that Hitler makes in this war, one of those mistakes is he listens to Hermann Goering, who said, you know, why risk troops in assaulting this pocket of BEF and Belgian troops at Dunkirk? Why don't you just let the Luftwaffe bomb them into submission? Well, while the Luftwaffe tried and the RAF fought them off, the British Navy, coupled with everything that floated, and there are pictures of pleasure yachts, any boat that floated really, tied together, 4 and 5 across and 4 and 5 deep. So 25 boats bumpered in between each other, but tied together, towed behind a tug to the beaches of Dunkirk, loaded until they were practically sinking with evacuating soldiers, and hauled back to Britain. And trip after trip after trip until they evacuated all of the British soldiers that they could. You see a picture of the equipment left behind, and this is just one stack of rifles and machine guns left behind by the British. There are pictures of hundreds and thousands of tanks and cars and vehicles that the British left inoperable, but left on the beaches, not being able to take any of their heavy equipment away with them, but getting the most important thing out, the men. Britain can get supplies from the United States, but it can't get more men. And so Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister of Great Britain, stands alone against the forces of the Wehrmacht. And I love that cartoon in the upper corner with the soldier defiantly shaking his fist at Germany, that Britain stands alone. I think the caption on the picture was "Very fine, thank you very much." And so Winston Churchill and his famous speech, and if you ever have to do a inspirational speech for speech class, or you want to read something that's inspirational, read about the context of the Battle of Britain, read about the context of Britain being alone in the war against Adolf Hitler, and then read Winston Churchill's Never Surrender speech, in which he decrees to the British people and to the world that Britain is going to continue fighting. It doesn't matter what happens, that even if Germany invades Britain and takes over London, that the British government will go into exile in the colonies and they'll continue the fight until there are no more colonies to fight from, that Britain will never, ever surrender. Well, Hitler puts that to the test. And as the American people, and that's the point here, not that Britain's alone, but that while these neutrality acts are in place, and the Neutrality Act of 1939 is in place, and its cash and carry provisions, and Americans who don't want to get involved, they're listening to the events of Dunkirk. They're listening to the events of the attack on France on the radio. And with these radio broadcasts by Edwin Murrow and others putting the color into what we would call today in an NFL game, a color commentator. The newscasters of the day, when they didn't have a picture to describe, they had to paint the listener a verbal picture and set the stage. So they're very colorful dramatizations of what's going on and giving as much detail as absolutely possible. And beginning in July of 1940, American reporters in London began telling of the Battle of Britain, as daily and nightly German bombers flew over the British Isles, dropping their payloads at first on war targets, and some would say then out of a circumstance that Hitler had dictated that London itself, the population center of London, wouldn't be targeted. But then while he was giving a speech in Berlin to the people of Berlin, telling them about the ongoing Battle of Britain and how the Germans were going to ultimately win the battle, British bombers infiltrated Berlin airspace and dropped bombs on Berlin to make Hitler a laughingstock while he was on the radio. In retaliation, Hitler then declared London fair game. In fact, if you want to catalog his errors, yet another mistake of Adolf Hitler was to make the strategic bombing of London personal and order the direct attacks on London. Rather than hitting industry, rather than hitting infrastructure, more importantly, rather than hitting the airfields where the Royal Air Force flew from, rather than hitting the radar installations that notified Britain of where those attacks were being launched from and where they were headed, Hitler tried to terrify the British population into submission. And so you see in the picture the the Heinkel 111 bombers. Hitler didn't have many large bombers, so these medium bombers were doing the heavy lifting, if you will, escorted by the various fighter planes that you see there, the Me-109 and the Me-110 and the Ju-88. All of these escorting the He-111s to bomb London back to the Stone Age. So through the summer of 1940, the American populace listened with horror at the details of these bombings. I experienced this to a lesser degree. You know, being a teacher, you kind of put things in context. And 1990, newly married, didn't have a TV. I've told you that before. We didn't have a TV. We just moved to Tyler in August of 1990 so I could resume at UT Tyler. And my wife and I went to Brookshire's to get groceries. And I don't particularly get that. I'm not that fond of grocery stores. So I decided to sit in the car. My 1975 Dodge Dart, believe me, it's not as impressive as it sounds. But that 1975 Dodge Dart had an AM radio. Didn't have an FM, had an AM radio. Forget about CD player, cassette player. Had an AM radio. So I'm listening to a local news station, KTBB, here in Tyler, as the Desert Storm becomes Desert Shield and the U.S. forces begin their attack on Iraq. And Iraqi forces launched their Scud missiles at Israel. And the radio announcers announcing from Tel Aviv are telling about the gunfire that they see, the anti-aircraft fire they see going up from the ground into the sky, and the searchlights trying to pinpoint incoming missiles, and the whoosh and roar of U.S. Patriot missiles as they flew out to intercept the incoming Scuds. And you can hear the wail in the background of the air raid siren. Well, I've heard radio records, modern records done of these broadcasts, and that's the picture you get. American audiences set transfixed as that wail of the air raid siren, and you could hear the crumph of the bombing in the distance getting louder and louder, and Edward R. Murrow would say, well, excuse me folks, we've got to take shelter, the bombs are coming closer. And you know, you would hear the scurry away from the microphone, and a few minutes back there would be dead air as you hear the bombing in the distance, and then he would come back, and we're back now, they've moved on. And Americans were horrified that this was taking place in Britain, our most recent ally. And then, of course, in fighting off the Battle of Britain, the RAF with their Spitfires and Hurricane fighters, and Hitler making his huge mistake not targeting their airfields or radar installations, they are able to fight off the Luftwaffe. Not without considerable damage. You see St. Paul's Cathedral and the bombing around the cathedral. The barrage balloons. These balloons are helium-filled balloons that you put above important installations. They're at different altitudes, but all of those balloons are trailing steel cables. And the idea is that if a German fighter plane wants to strafe civilians on the ground, they have to fly low. And if they fly low, you've got these balloons suspended above them, and the iron cables or steel cables can get caught in engines. They can snap off wings. If you're flying, 170 miles an hour and you hit a steel cable, especially in a fabric airplane or even an aluminum airplane, it's going to rip through whatever wing or tail or whatever, and an airplane without a wing is a rock. You're going to go down. And so the idea was to prevent strafing of important targets by putting up the barrage balloons. And then in the far picture you can see London Bridge with the fire and from a recent air raid behind it. And so London fights off the Battle of Britain, but it shifted American public opinion in favor of the Allies, especially in favor of helping Britain. Not getting involved in the war, but helping Britain. And then Hitler launches his next phase, which is the U-boat war against Great Britain. Just like in World War I, U-boats attempting to isolate, attempting to cut off all incoming shipping and force Britain to its knees because it's simply exhausted. If the Battle of Britain had gone different and the Luftwaffe had silenced the RAF and the U-boats controlling the English Channel, Hitler was anticipating an invasion of England. But with the RAF having air superiority and the British Navy still able to maintain control of the English Channel, Hitler's going to be forced to turn to other venues of attack. And so throughout the rest of the war, from September to May, the U-boat and groups of U-boats operating as wolf packs will attack American shipping and British shipping and French shipping in the Atlantic, called the Battle of the Atlantic. As the war expands, in June of 1940, Hitler launches an assault across North Africa, trying to capture the all-important oil fields of the Middle East, drive the British out of Egypt, seize the Suez Canal, and thus be able to open up a direct pathway to Germany's ally, Japan. But certainly eliminating the British from the Mediterranean would be a huge step forward, and in gaining access to the oil and resources of the Middle East would fuel the war machine. So from June 1940 to May of 1943, war is going to rage back and forth across the deserts of North Africa, with General Erwin Rommel seen as a good German. I'll leave that to other venues to determine whether he was a Nazi or whether he was not. He ultimately will fall victim to Adolf Hitler in 1944. But nonetheless, in North Africa, he is the man. He seems to be where the British don't expect him, and he seems to be winning the war for the Germans in the African desert. And Britain becomes desperate not only for supplies, but an ally. Hitler then makes his greatest mistake of the war. June 1941, he launches Operation Barbarossa. Having convinced Joe Stalin that he would never attack the Soviet Union, having made the agreement over Poland to divide Poland between the Soviet Union and Germany, having used the Soviet Union to rearm, Stalin, for some reason, trusted Hitler. And on June 22nd, 1941, Germany launches an all-out offensive against the Soviet Union in the hopes of capturing Moscow and knocking the Soviets out, seizing a northern route to the oil fields of the Middle East, and gaining the resources that Hitler so desperately needs. And you can see, and this isn't the extent of, but the initial attacks of the Germans into Russia, gaining thousands of miles of territory in just weeks. Then, of course, the winter of 1941, the attacks bogged down and slowed down with Russia's two greatest generals, General Mudd and General Winter. Those two factors combined, the mud and the weather, slowing down the assault until the Soviet Union could get its troops up to speed and counteract the German attack. In the midst of all of this, though, 1940 is an election year. And in the midst of the chaos, Britain standing alone, the Battle of Britain, Roosevelt being given the cash and carry authority that he so desperately wanted. In September of 1940, the U.S. Congress adopted the first peacetime draft in American history, but we also conduct an election. The Republicans nominate a Democrat light. He was a former Democrat who had turned to Republicans. He was an isolationist, which was his main goal was isolation. He was not a anti-New Dealer. He was a strong New Dealer. He was just anti-intervention. Wendell Willkie will get the Republican nomination. And in an unprecedented move, never before done in history, Franklin Roosevelt decides that he will run for a third term, that he is too indispensable to victory and to the national crisis that's going on to change horses in midstream. And so Roosevelt runs for and wins a third term, replacing John Nance Garner with Henry Wallace as vice president. The electoral vote, not as good as in his last election, but still ample to win. Roosevelt sweeps across the South, the East, and the far West. And so Roosevelt, carrying most of his cabinet with him, is going to enter office for that third term. He's then going to request from Congress, with the election behind him and the inauguration behind him, he then requests Congress to change American neutrality laws from cash and carry. Britain and France are running out of money. And so he asks Congress for the authority to implement a new program called Lend-Lease. That we will lend Britain and France, what's left of the French army in Britain. Let me be clear there. France is knocked out of the war. But French exiles, Charles de Gaulle and others in England, are putting together a free French force to return to France. But Roosevelt proposes that with the impending conflict, especially ultimately Operation Barbarossa, that American allies need American support. And that Great Britain, the Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and France should receive Lend-Lease aid. Meaning we loan them tanks. If in the course of the war those tanks are destroyed, then they can buy them. Otherwise, they can return them. And so Lend-Lease was a way to provide American allies with the tools that they needed to conduct the war. And Lend-Lease is going to have a dramatic impact on the course of the conflict. Now, America's not in the war, but we began funneling all of the tools that the rest of the world will need to oppose Japan, Italy, and Germany. So Lend-Lease, a dramatic change in American neutrality laws. Ironically, Wendell Willkie in the 1940 election had said, if you re-elect FDR, you may expect war in April of 1941. FDR had replied, I have said this before, but shall say it again and again and again, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war. Almost immediately, Wendell Willkie had it wrong. It wouldn't be April of 1941. It would be December of 1941, but he didn't miss it by much. Lend-Lease, authorized on January 10th, 1941, as you see on the board, authorized the president to sell, transfer, exchange, lend, lease, or otherwise dispose of arms and equipment and supplies to any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. And so Britain and China became the first recipients. France, a lesser recipient in Britain, and then ultimately the Soviet Union once Operation Barbarossa brings Russia into the Allied fold. Churchill is desperate for America to get involved. In fact, he will ask FDR to meet him August 14th, 1941, in a secret meeting on a battleship off the coast of Nova Scotia. Roosevelt and Churchill will meet in what is known as the Atlantic Charter Conference. In effect, the Atlantic Charter Conference is a joint declaration of war aims. It called for self-determination of all peoples, economic cooperation, freedom of the seas, and a new international security collective. Have you heard these before? Of course you have. They're Wilson's 14 points recycled for a different war by a different president. And so the United States takes a huge step toward war and non-neutrality with the Atlantic Charter Conference. Over the course of the summer of 1941, American ships become the target of German U-boats. American destroyers begin escorting convoys halfway across the Atlantic. And then the British Navy would meet the convoy and take it the rest of the way. This was a way for Britain to maximize its fleet. Rather than having to go the whole way, it only had to go halfway. And so its ships could do double duty. The first attack on an American warship occurred on September 4th, 1941. A German submarine fired 2 torpedoes at an American destroyer. This gave Roosevelt justification to request from Congress and to order American ships to shoot on sight any German or Italian raider that ventured into American defensive waters. Or what are American defensive waters? Well, halfway across the Atlantic. 5 days after the declaration of shoot on sight, the U.S. Navy announced it would escort all the way to Iceland. And on November 17th, 1941, notice the timeline, November 17th, 1941, Congress removes the ban on merchant ships being armed, which will allow merchant ships to fire on submarines that surface. Allows American merchant ships to enter combat zones and belligerent ports. In other words, the United States has now given up neutrality. If we ever were neutral, we have now given it up. The only final step will be all-out war. But that's going to take a direct act of war, and it won't come in the Atlantic. It will, in fact, come in the Pacific on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, where we'll pick up next time.